I have faced my own doubts in my career. About 30 years ago, I was going through what I think is a classic period of angst. I was 10, 12 years out of college. I was going through that period where I was saying, is this it? Is this all there is? For those of you who haven't hit that, you'll get there, trust me. And what I was really facing was that I was going to these intense situations in the world and watching people who were struggling to save dying children, doctors who were working with cancer patients, researchers were trying to find cures for Alzheimer's, people who were doing hard hands-on work, and I showed up with questions and a notebook. And I thought, what the hell good am I? What the hell good is this thing I do? And then I found that answer. There's a story I like to tell about my time in Africa. It's 1985. I was a young journalist in my early 30s and working for a fairly small metropolitan newspaper in Minnesota. And there was this huge famine that caught the world's attention, centered in what was then Ethiopia. And it was complicated by war. So for years and years and years, there was a drought and famine, and people had less and less food, and then the warplanes would come along and they'd bomb these farmers. And finally it got so bad that entire villages, or what was left of them, got up and walked to refugee camps in Sudan across the border. I had a very ambitious editor, and she said, this is the biggest story in the world and I don't want to miss it. She grabbed me and a photographer and she sent us to Africa. I had never been out of the country except to Canada, and if you're from Minnesota, Canada is kind of like your backyard. They talk a little funny, but otherwise they're cool. And I can talk like them. Can't talk like you, I can talk like them. So I land in Africa, and all of the big networks are there, and all of the big newspaper people, and Jean, the photographer, and I are hitchhiking while everybody else has rented a Jeep and has a translator and a driver. We are knocking on doors at NGOs to try to find a place to sleep and a squat latrine and a glass of water to bathe in. We're scared, we're hungry, and we don't know if we're up to the task. I can take care of it. I'll be right, thanks. Or not, and then I'll call you up. So we were at a refugee camp on a dry riverbed, border of Sudan. And this refugee camp had not existed 3 months earlier. And when we got there, there were more than 100,000 people squatting there. These were all people who had gotten up and moved because they had heard there was water and food. By the time they got there, the water was no more than a little mud way, way, way down in the bed of the river. We would watch little girls dig holes and stick rags in, and pull the rags out and squeeze and squeeze and squeeze to try to get out drops of water. The food would show up on trucks, and it was basically gruel, maybe a little bit of wheat, that the women would put on top of a metal lid, and they'd pop it like popcorn. They had a very little bit of oil. They didn't have any bread. When bread showed up, there were usually fights over it. Jean and I would walk around this refugee camp during the day, trying to talk to people, trying to bear witness to what was going on, trying to understand the magnitude of the horror we were seeing. And at night, once it grew dark, we had to leave the refugee camp, which means we had to go outside a little gate and sleep on the other side of a straw wall. If you've ever been to Africa, when the sun goes down, it goes down. It is dark. And it goes down really fast. So Jean and I would be laying there on these cots in this straw hut, and we couldn't see anything, and we couldn't talk to anybody anymore until the next morning, but we could hear everything. Hear everything. And I'd lay awake at night, we were both scared, and I'd listen to people coughing and coughing and coughing until the cough turned to a death rattle, and I'd listen to them die. I'd listen to babies crying and crying and crying until the crying stopped, and I would know that the next morning 75 babies would be dead. We listened to people make love. Just an interesting thing people do when they're facing death. We listened to people get out of their little huts, which were basically twigs and plastic, and try to walk and the little paths out to the defecation zone, which was a field on the side of the refugee camp. It was the only latrines they had. They hadn't had time to dig latrines, so they went and they squatted in a field. Most of them were too sick to make it, so we would listen to them squat in the path and do their business there. All of these sounds, and even the sounds of making love, became sort of the sounds of death and of horror. But through it all, every night, I heard this weird thing that sounded like singing. Rhythmic singing. Every night for about 20, 30 minutes at about the same time. Finally, incredible, intrepid journalist that I am, about the 5th time I heard it, I went, what the heck's going on? So I went and talked to a guy and I said, what is that? What is that? And he said, oh, those are the stories. Those are the stories. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, when people get up in their villages or in their families and they walked here, they were mostly from an agrarian society. They didn't have a written language, many of them. They hadn't gone to school. And so their tradition in these places, these rural places, was for the elders to sit around at night and sing stories to the children. So they sang of their history, and they sang of their morals, and they sang of their religion, and of their hope, and of their relatives and their families. So when these families, the survivors, got up from their villages and their homes and walked sometimes 3-4 weeks to get to a refugee camp, they brought what they could carry. They brought their surviving relatives or friends, many who died along the way. They brought a blanket, they maybe brought a pot, and they brought their stories. Those stories survived everything. And I realized then that what I do, if I do it well, does have a purpose, and it does matter, and it's as important as anybody who reaches out and saves a life one by one with their hands. So that's what I try to do with stories.